In the autumn of 1969, a brutal crime in Oakland, California, left behind a mystery that endures to this day. On October 2nd, 1969, staff at the St. Louis Hotel on 7th Street in Oakland discovered the body of a recently deceased young woman in room 15. The scene was extremely grim and violent. An autopsy later revealed she had been beaten severely and then strangled, reportedly with a piece of her own clothing. The coroner determined she had died only a few hours before she was found, meaning the perpetrator likely fled not long before the body's discovery. There was no identification found with her, nothing that immediately gave away who she was. Oakland police detectives were faced with two urgent tasks: identify the victim and catch whoever was responsible for this horrific act. Early clues gave investigators some leads on the second task. Witnesses reported seeing the young woman enter the hotel room with a man earlier that day. The description of that man was alarming. It appeared to match Taylor Morris Teaford, a fugitive already wanted by the FBI. Teaford was a 34-year-old man with a history of violence, and he had been on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list since 1968 for a variety of extremely violent offenses. According to later reports, Teaford was indeed suspected of attacking multiple women in Northern California around that time. Investigators came to believe that Teaford was the man in the hotel with the Jane Doe, and likely the perpetrator. In 1972, although Teaford was still at large, authorities charged him in absentia with the slaying of the unidentified woman. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and the case effectively became a hunt for a fugitive killer and of his victim. Teaford, however, evaded capture, and over the years, he was rumored to have been seen in various places across the country, but he was never arrested for this crime. By all accounts, he lived a life on the run. Given his age, he would be in his late 80s as of today, so it's quite possible he died a fugitive. With the prime suspect out of reach, the case stalled. Yet even as the search for Teaford went on, a parallel investigation continued to try to identify the young woman he was believed to have slain. Her fingerprints were taken and checked against databases of missing persons and criminal records of the time, but no match was found. In 1969, there were no DNA tests or national computer systems to aid the search, so investigators relied on physical clues and old-fashioned legwork. They carefully noted her appearance and belongings, hoping something would trigger recognition from the public. The victim was described as a white female, estimated to be in her late teens to mid-20s. She had short, dark brown or auburn hair and striking blue eyes, which investigators believe would have been a particularly memorable feature. Despite her youth, one distinctive feature stood out. She wore a partial dental plate replacing her upper front tooth. This was a professionally made denture piece and had been repaired multiple times, suggesting she'd lost that tooth sometime earlier and had worn the denture for a while. Investigators publicized this unusual detail, thinking perhaps a dentist or someone who knew her might recognize it. They also noted she had some faded scars along her right forearm and evidence of needle marks on her arms, indicating likely substance use issues. At the crime scene, in addition to the white knit dress she was wearing, there were several other articles of clothing presumably belonging to her. Investigators found colorful bell-bottom pants, a bright patterned blouse, a striped mini dress, a white sweater, and white knee-high boots. These fashionable, youth-oriented clothes painted a picture of a young woman living in the late 1960s style. All of these details were documented and released to the media in hopes that a missing persons report somewhere might match up, but initially, no leads materialized on her identity. Presumably, there may be additional details which weren't released to the media, though I would imagine at this point, the authorities couldn't be holding too much back. Or at least, I would hope that's the case, because at this point, the crime is almost 60 years past. So yeah, I think it's time to go for the Hail Mary pass. From the very beginning, the mystery woman's identity has been the subject of much speculation. Who was this young Jane Doe, and what circumstances led her into the company of a dangerous man like Taylor Teaford, or perhaps an as yet unknown, but also extremely dangerous individual? One early theory was that she may have been involved in escort work. This raised the possibility that the Alameda County Jane Doe wasn't an isolated case, but part of a series of slayings targeting women in this line of work in Northern California. The brutality of the crime and the hotel setting did align with what law enforcement often saw in cases of predators preying on vulnerable young women. The escort theory could explain why no immediate missing person report matched the victim. If she had been estranged from family or living under the radar, her disappearance might not have been noted right away. Another theory has been that the Jane Doe was a runaway or transient who traveled to California during the tumultuous late 1960s. The Bay Area was a magnet for young people in that era: hitchhikers, flower children, and those drawn by the counterculture movement. But sadly, not all of those journeys ended well. It's possible the victim had come from another state, leaving home as a teenager and losing touch with her family. Her substance use evidence might point to a difficult life on the streets or involvement in the 1960s counterculture. If she had been moving from place to place, her family, if she had one searching for her, might not have known she was in Oakland. Further missing persons records back then were not well coordinated nationally. This could explain why her identity didn't surface immediately. In 1969, a missing young woman from another jurisdiction wouldn't automatically be connected to an unidentified body in California. Even today, with the vast interconnectivity brought to us by the digital age, this is still the case, though to a lesser extent. Over the years, various potential identities have been examined. Periodically, when a long-term missing person case seemed to match the Jane Doe's profile, authorities would compare details. For instance, one candidate that drew attention was a teen girl who went missing from Missouri in 1963, around the same age and physical description. With this case, and with many others, fingerprints and dental records would later rule out any connection. In the decades since 1969, the case of the Alameda County Jane Doe has never been completely forgotten. Investigators and advocates continue to pursue new ways to identify her, even long after the trail went cold. One significant modern effort has been the use of forensic reconstruction to put a face to the victim beyond the old morgue photographs. This image has been circulated in law enforcement bulletins and online cold case communities. By sharing the reconstructed likeness along with details of the case, authorities hope that it might jog the memory of a witness or prompt a family member to come forward with information. After all, even though many years have passed, there is a chance that someone out there remembers a girl who went missing around 1969 and never knew what happened to her. Advances in technology have also opened new avenues. The late 20th century and early 21st brought DNA analysis into crime solving, and more recently, genetic genealogy has cracked hundreds of cold cases. In principle, this technique could be the key to giving the 1969 Jane Doe her name. Forensic genealogy involves extracting DNA from the remains, building a genetic profile, and searching genealogical databases for relatives. In practice, however, this case faces a hurdle: the availability of viable DNA. Records indicate that no DNA profile has yet been obtained from the victim's remains. Given the era of the case, her body may have been buried without the preservation of samples, or any DNA that exists might be highly degraded. That said, technology is constantly improving, and even trace genetic material from decades-old evidence can sometimes yield results now. There have been discussions about exhumation or retesting old evidence to try to get a DNA sample. If successful, investigators could potentially enlist organizations that specialize in cold case identifications to apply genealogical research. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder for you to share this video with two of your friends or your family members. Also, remember to hit like and subscribe, and also remember to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also, don't forget to check out my history channel and my true crime channel if you want more of my content. It was a scene that could have been pulled from a heist thriller. On the evening of May 25th, 2003, as dusk settled over 4 de Fevereiro International Airport in Luanda, Angola, a large Boeing 727 airliner unexpectedly began lumbering down the runway. There were no lights on the aircraft and no communication with the control tower. Air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as the unregistered jet picked up speed. Without clearance, it roared into the air and banked toward the southwest, vanishing into the twilight over the Atlantic Ocean. In the cockpit, by most accounts, were two men, an American aviation engineer and a Congolese mechanic, neither of whom was fully qualified to fly that plane. The Boeing 727 and the men on board have never been seen again. The aircraft at the center of this mystery was a Boeing 727-223 model, a three-engine jetliner built in 1975. For 25 years, it flew passengers across the United States as part of the American Airlines fleet. By 2001, the aging 727 was retired from commercial service. A Miami-based company called Aerospace Sales and Leasing, led by businessman Maury Joseph, acquired the plane, seeing opportunity in its remaining value. The jet, still bearing its faded American Airlines livery of unpolished silver skin with blue, white, and red stripes, was reconfigured for a new life. All the passenger seats were stripped out of its cabin, and it was outfitted with large fuel tanks, essentially converting it into a flying fuel tanker. The plan was to use the 727 to ferry diesel fuel to remote diamond mining operations in Angola, a country where ground transport was perilous after decades of civil war. In early 2002, the Boeing 727, now identified by its tail number N844AA, was flown from the United States to Africa. A South African entrepreneur named Keith Irwin had leased the aircraft from Joseph's company for the fuel delivery venture. He assembled a crew and installed 10 collapsible fuel tanks inside the plane's fuselage. The jet departed Miami at the end of February 2002 and arrived in Luanda, Angola in mid-March after delays. However, upon arrival, the business deal began to unravel. The Angolan client failed to pay the promised funds, leaving the crew stranded and the aircraft stuck on the airport tarmac. Over the next weeks, tensions grew, and the foreign flight crew faced harsh living conditions and even feared for their safety amid the turbulent environment. Disputes escalated to the point where some crew members quietly plotted to fly the 727 out of Angola on their own to escape the situation. Only intervention by the U.S. Embassy resolved the standoff, allowing the crew to recover their passports and leave the country. One by one, the disheartened pilots and engineers returned home, and by mid-2002, the hastily conceived fuel hauling operation had collapsed. What remained was the airplane itself, abandoned at Luanda's airport with no flight crew and mounting debts. The once proud jetliner sat idle for over a year, one of a couple of derelict planes at the field. During those 14 months of inactivity, it accrued an eye-watering sum of over $4 million in parking fees and other charges. Weather and lack of maintenance took a toll on the 727's condition. By late 2002, its future was uncertain. The aircraft was essentially a hostage to unpaid bills and a failed venture. Maury Joseph, the owner, still had a stake in the plane and its valuable engines, and he wasn't ready to write it off. Joseph negotiated with authorities and sought a solution to either get the jet flying again or at least recoup his losses by selling its parts. By spring 2003, he had arranged for the 727 to be repaired, refueled, and flown out of Angola to be delivered to a new customer in South Africa. To carry out this plan, Joseph turned to a trusted contractor, an American man named Ben Padilla, to oversee the refurbishment and retrieval of the aircraft. Ben Padilla was the main figure on the ground in Angola, working to reclaim the 727. Padilla was a 50-year-old aircraft mechanic and certified flight engineer from Florida. He was no stranger to aviation challenges. He had years of experience maintaining and ferrying airplanes, including working in various African countries. Though Padilla had a private pilot's license, he wasn't qualified to fly a large jet airliner like the Boeing 727 as a captain. Still, he was resourceful and knowledgeable about this specific plane, and he had been involved with it during previous jobs for Maury Joseph. In April 2003, Padilla arrived in Luanda as Joseph's agent. His mission was to pay off the outstanding fees, hire local technicians, and restore the long-neglected 727 to airworthiness. By all accounts, Padilla threw himself into the task. He coordinated with an Angolan maintenance firm and even arranged to hire a crew from a local airline, including a qualified pilot and co-pilot, to fly the jet out once it was ready. Padilla's family later described him as a man who would not have casually risked flying that big jet alone. Simply put, they didn't believe he was a big risk taker. They believe he must have been swept up in events beyond his control. Alongside Padilla was John Michael Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo. Mutantu had been hired recently to assist Padilla with the repairs. Little is publicly known about Mutantu's background. He was essentially a contract worker brought in for his technical skills. What is known, though, is that he wasn't a pilot at all, but a mechanic helping to get the Boeing ready for its ferry flight. Mutantu and Padilla worked together in those final weeks of May 2003, replacing parts, testing systems, and fueling the jet for its much-anticipated departure. These two men would ultimately become the central characters in the plane's disappearance, as they were the ones last seen aboard the aircraft before it vanished. Neither Padilla nor Mutantu has been heard from since the day of the disappearance. Another key player in this saga is Maury Joseph, the owner of the aircraft. Joseph was not on site in Angola at the time of the disappearance, but he had orchestrated the effort to recover the plane. A businessman based in Miami, Joseph had what some have alleged to be a slightly checkered history in the aviation leasing world. However, other sources indicate that none of his business practices were out of the ordinary for high-risk airplane leasing. He wasn't in Angola at the time of the disappearance. Instead, he was awaiting the jet's delivery to a buyer in South Africa. On the day the plane went missing, Joseph was in Johannesburg, expecting to greet his crew and client. Little did he know what would happen next. By late May 2003, the Boeing 727 was finally in taxiing condition after extensive repairs. Padilla had settled many of the airport fines using funds from the owner, and the plan was to fly the aircraft out within days. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 25th, Padilla made arrangements for a final test. He intended to taxi the 727 to the main runway and perform a high-power engine run-up, a common procedure to check the systems under load. That evening, as the golden light of sunset tinged the airport, the 727 indeed began to move. But what happened next was anything but a routine test. Shortly before 5 p.m. local time, to the surprise of ground staff, the Boeing 727 suddenly powered up and started rolling toward the runway. Ben Padilla and John Mutantu had been seen boarding the aircraft moments before. No other qualified pilot was with them, and crucially, the two had no clearance to take off. An airport employee later reported seeing only one person in the cockpit, but others were certain both men had climbed aboard. The control tower tried frantically to hail the 727 on the radio, but there was only silence. The big jetliner swung erratically into position on the runway. Its landing lights were switched off, and its transponder, the device that identifies an aircraft on radar, was not transmitting. Essentially, the aircraft had gone both dark and rogue on the airfield. Ground personnel could only watch as the 727 barreled down the runway. Gaining speed, it lifted off into the evening sky without permission. Tower controllers kept calling out to the plane with no response. The jet turned southwest, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, and within minutes it disappeared from Luanda's radar. Just like that, the massive plane was gone. It carried with it the two men, and also an enormous quantity of fuel. The aircraft's tanks had been topped up with 14,000 gallons of fuel, enough for roughly 1,500 miles of flight. This fuel would allow it to reach many destinations across Africa. As darkness fell, no one knew whether the aircraft was flying steadily toward some clandestine landing spot, or if it was in trouble and about to crash into the sea. The airport authorities in Luanda were in disbelief and alarm. They had a missing airliner on their hands, one that had essentially been stolen in plain sight. Immediate attempts to locate or contact the aircraft were fruitless. In neighboring countries, air traffic monitors were asked if they had any unidentified blips on their radar screens, but none did. The 727 seemed to have vanished into thin air. Back in Johannesburg, owner Maury Joseph was expecting the plane's arrival the next day. Instead, he got the call that every owner of a commercial airliner dreads. His plane was stolen from the runway. And honestly, I wrote that line without thinking about how absurd it sounds. And yes, I decided it was too good and silly not to keep it in. An Angolan aviation official demanded to know why Joseph's plane had left with an unauthorized crew and under such weird circumstances. Joseph quickly called the U.S. Embassy and his contacts to report that his airplane had been stolen. And it's important to remember that this happened very soon after the events of 2001, so the world immediately went on highest alert. The disappearance of the Boeing from Angola triggered a global investigation and a whirlwind of speculation. In the hours and days after the plane went missing, American authorities, including the FBI, CIA, and State Department, worked alongside international agencies to track down any trace of the jet. If someone intended to use this plane as a weapon or for illegal activities, the clock was ticking. Intelligence analysts scanned satellite images for signs of a crash, perhaps an oil slick on the ocean or scorched earth in the African bush. Military surveillance teams considered the possibility of intercepting the rogue aircraft if it appeared on any radar. For a time, U.S. officials even contemplated moving fighter jets into positions in Africa, ready to respond if the 727 was spotted threatening any strategic targets. In those tense initial hours and days, it was as if a ghost plane was haunting the authorities' imaginations. Despite the intense search, no definitive sightings or wreckage were found. False leads cropped up. At one point, rumors suggested the aircraft might have crashed off the coast, or that it landed at an abandoned strip somewhere in Central Africa. In July 2003, about a month after the disappearance, a tantalizing report emerged from West Africa. A veteran pilot claimed to have spotted a mysteriously familiar Boeing 727 at an airport in Conakry, Guinea. The plane he saw had a new paint job and a Guinean registration number, but faintly visible on its tail were the telltale letters AA, the same last letters of the U.S. registration. This eyewitness was convinced it was the missing Angola 727, potentially being used to covertly haul cargo. The report caused a stir. But when U.S. officials investigated further, they concluded it was a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps even a hoax. The Guinean plane, they said, wasn't the stolen jet after all, and hope of an easy answer evaporated. With an enduring mystery and no hard facts, various theories have taken root over the years. One of the simplest explanations is a tragic accident. The Boeing 727 was a complex aircraft requiring 3 trained crew members to fly safely. On that evening, it likely had just Ben Padilla at the controls, a man who, while experienced with aircraft, was not certified to fly a 727. John Mutantu, the mechanic, would have been of little to no help in the cockpit given his skill set. It's entirely possible that once airborne, the makeshift crew found the jetliner too much plane to handle. A mispiloted turn, an instrument mix-up, or an in-flight emergency could have led the plane to crash into the Atlantic Ocean not long after takeoff, before anyone could even report a sighting. If the 727 plunged into deep tropical waters, heavy with fuel, it might have sunk almost intact, leaving little to no debris for searchers to find. Padilla's own family leans toward this theory. They fear that he died in a crash after getting the plane off the ground, perhaps heroically trying to save it from disaster until the last moment. Another possibility is that the plane did not crash at all, but was stolen for clandestine purposes. Could Ben or John themselves have been in on such a heist, or were they overpowered by others? Some have speculated that a third person might have snuck on board the 727, or that Padilla and Mutantu were forced to fly the aircraft to a secret location. The plane had enough fuel to fly about 4 to 5 hours, putting a vast radius of remote Africa within reach. Conceivably, the jet could have headed inland and landed on an isolated airstrip in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo or elsewhere, far from prying eyes. A 727 alongside someone who could fly it, and a mechanic, could be extremely useful to a warlord or a criminal cartel. Under this theory, after the chaotic takeoff, the aircraft might have been flown to a prearranged hiding spot, its exterior quickly repainted and identity changed. It could have been stashed in a hangar or camouflaged at a remote airfield. Even today it might be out there somewhere, quietly rusting away or continuing to operate under a false identity. This idea sounds like the plot of a movie, but it's a scenario investigators considered seriously for a time. In the absence of answers, the fate of the Angola Boeing has remained one of aviation's great unsolved mysteries. The FBI formally closed its case in 2005, having turned up no leads that could definitively explain what happened.